The boardroom gleamed with polished wood and glass, tension thick as executives hovered over a $4.2 billion contract. At the door stood Mark Davis, 41, a janitor in a faded uniform, gripping his mop like a shield. Heart pounding, he stepped forward, voice breaking the silence. "Don't sign it." Shock rippled across the room, all eyes turning to him. Even the CEO froze. "Stay with us. This touching story will leave you speechless." Mark Davis had been cleaning the Carter Industries skyscraper for 3 years, working the night shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., while his 12-year-old daughter Hannah slept at home. The job wasn't glamorous, mopping floors, emptying trash bins, wiping down conference tables where millionaire executives made decisions that affected thousands of lives. But it paid enough to keep their small apartment and put food on the table. He was invisible to most people who worked in the gleaming tower, just another uniformed figure pushing a cart through hallways lined with expensive artwork and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Executives walked past him without acknowledgement, their conversations continuing as though he possessed neither ears nor intelligence to understand what they discussed. But Mark was observant by nature, a quality that had served him well during his brief military service before Hannah was born, and his wife Sarah was diagnosed with cancer. He listened while he worked, not from nosiness, but from the survival instinct that comes with being powerless in a world where powerful people make decisions that trickle down to affect everyone below them. One evening in late October, as he cleaned the 42nd floor executive conference room, Mark overheard fragments of conversation that made his blood run cold. The executives weren't aware he was still there, having dismissed him from their consciousness the moment he entered with his cleaning supplies. "The acquisition will eliminate redundancies," one voice was saying. "We're looking at 15,000 layoffs minimum, maybe 20. Stock price will soar once investors see the cost savings." Another added with the casual tone people use when discussing numbers rather than human lives. Mark's hands stilled on the table he was wiping as he realized they were talking about the Carter-Morrison merger, a deal that would make Elena Carter's company one of the largest telecommunications providers in the country, but would also destroy entire communities where Carter Industries' manufacturing plants provided the economic backbone. For 3 sleepless days, Mark wrestled with what he had overheard. 15,000 families would lose their income so that wealthy shareholders could see bigger returns on their investments. 15,000 people like himself, struggling to pay rent and keep their children fed, would be sacrificed for numbers on quarterly reports. His daughter Hannah noticed his distraction. "Dad, you're not listening to my math homework," she complained one evening, her pencil poised over long division problems that seemed insignificant compared to the moral division consuming his thoughts. "Sorry, sweetheart," Mark said, forcing himself to focus on her worksheet rather than the weight of knowledge he carried about her uncertain future. On Friday evening, as he approached the executive boardroom for his routine cleaning, Mark saw through the frosted glass doors that a meeting was still in progress. The $4.2 billion contract lay spread across the mahogany table, signatures being added with the ceremony that accompanies historic business deals. Standing in the hallway with his mop bucket and cart, Mark faced the most important decision of his life. He could walk away, finish his shift quietly, and pretend he had never heard conversations that weren't meant for his ears. He could protect his job, his family's stability, his own safety, or he could step through those doors and speak truth to power, knowing it would likely cost him everything he had worked to build for Hannah's sake. His heart pounding so hard he could hear it over the building's ventilation system, Mark gripped his mop like a shield and stepped forward. Mark's entry into the boardroom created the kind of silence that occurs when established hierarchies are suddenly challenged by unexpected forces. 12 executives in tailored suits turned to stare at the janitor, who had dared interrupt their historic moment, their faces reflecting mixtures of outrage, confusion, and disbelief. "Security!" so someone shouted immediately. But Elena Carter, the company's CEO, raised her hand in a gesture that commanded instant obedience throughout her corporate empire. Elena was a woman who had built her fortune through calculated risks and decisive action, but she had also survived in the business world by recognizing valuable information regardless of its source. Something in Mark's expression, not desperation or grandstanding, but quiet certainty, made her pause before having him removed. "Explain yourself," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to cutting through noise to reach essential truth. "You have 30 seconds." Mark's voice shook as he spoke, but his words were clear. "This merger will destroy 15,000 jobs. I've heard your people talking. They plan to close the manufacturing plants, eliminate redundancies, maximize cost savings. Those aren't numbers on spreadsheets. Those are families with children who need food and rent money." Gasps erupted around the table as executives realized their private conversations had been overheard by someone they considered invisible. Several board members began speaking at once. "This is outrageous. How dare a janitor lecture us about business? Elena, call security immediately." But Elena studied Mark with the intense focus she typically reserved for quarterly profit reports and merger documents. "You listen to our meetings?" "I clean around them," Mark replied honestly. "You talk like I'm not there, but I hear everything. The real plans, not the public relations versions you'll announce to the press." Elena demanded proof, and Mark, his hands trembling but his voice growing stronger, recounted specific conversations. How the Midwest plants would be shuttered within 6 months, how entire departments would be eliminated through operational efficiencies, how communities that had depended on Carter Industries for generations would be left with empty buildings and unemployment lines. The executives scoffed, their mockery growing louder. "This is absurd. We're taking business advice from someone who mops floors for minimum wage." But Elena noticed details that her highly paid advisors had missed. Mark's knowledge wasn't just observational, but analytical, born from years of watching how corporate decisions affected real people's lives. His insights carried the weight of lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Later that evening, as the other executives departed in frustrated anger, Elena found Mark in the building's lobby, methodically cleaning the marble floors with the same careful attention he brought to everything else in his life. "I could fire you," she said without preamble, her voice carrying neither threat nor comfort, just statement of fact. "I know," Mark replied, continuing his work, "but I couldn't stay silent when I knew what was going to happen to those families." Elena asked about his own family, and Mark spoke quietly about Hannah, about his wife Sarah, who had died from cancer 3 years earlier, about the struggle to raise a brilliant daughter on a janitor's wages while maintaining the hope that her future would be brighter than his present. "She draws pictures of superheroes," Mark said with a slight smile. "Always tells me that heroes help people, even when it's hard." Elena, who had built walls around her emotions as high as the skyscraper she owned, felt something shift inside her chest. This man had risked his livelihood not for personal gain, but because his conscience wouldn't allow him to remain silent while others suffered. Over the following days, Elena began doing something unprecedented in her corporate career. She secretly invited Mark to review merger documents with her, seeking perspective that her MBA-educated advisors couldn't provide. His observations, filtered through years of economic struggle and honest work, revealed human costs that sophisticated financial models had failed to calculate. The breakthrough moment came when Hannah appeared in the lobby one afternoon while Mark worked, her school backpack full of colored pencils and sketch paper. She approached Elena without fear or deference, simply handing her a drawing of a man in a janitor's uniform with a cape flowing behind him. "That's my dad," Hannah said with the matter-of-fact pride that children show when describing their heroes. "He helps people." Elena stared at the drawing longer than necessary, seeing not just a child's artwork, but a reminder of something she had lost during her climb to corporate success. Keep watching, because Mark's truth will soon collide with powerful enemies who won't hesitate to destroy him. Within days of Elena's unusual consultations with Mark, word spread through the executive ranks like wildfire through dry timber. Board members who had spent years accumulating power and wealth suddenly found their authority challenged by someone they considered beneath their notice, and their reaction was swift and vicious. "This is insane, Elena," declared Richard Morrison, the senior vice president whose personal wealth was tied directly to the merger's success. "You're jeopardizing a $4 billion deal because a janitor told you some sob story about unemployment?" The boardroom became a battlefield where Mark's credibility was systematically attacked by people who had never spent a day worrying about rent money or medical bills. They questioned his education, his motives, his right to have opinions about business matters that affected shareholder value and quarterly earnings. Several executives threatened to resign if Elena continued, This embarrassing charade of consulting with maintenance staff about corporate strategy. Others began plotting behind her back, making calls to major shareholders and suggesting that their CEO had lost perspective and needed to be replaced by someone with clearer priorities. The pressure mounted daily. Financial journalists began asking questions about delays in the merger announcement. Stock prices fluctuated as rumors spread about internal conflicts at Carter Industries. Elena's assistant fielded dozens of calls from investors, demanding explanations for the uncertainty that was costing them money with each passing hour. Late one evening, as Elena sat in her corner office reviewing merger documents for the 100th time, Mark appeared in her doorway with his cleaning cart. She looked up from spreadsheets that showed millions in projected profits, her face drawn with exhaustion and stress. "Why risk everything?" she asked him, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had built an empire and now watched it teetering on the edge of collapse. "Why couldn't you just stay silent like everyone else? You had a job, a steady paycheck. Why throw it all away?" Mark set down his mop and looked directly at the most powerful person he had ever encountered, his answer carrying the simple honesty that had guided every major decision in his life. "Because my daughter deserves to grow up in a world where people matter more than profits. Because 15,000 families deserve better than being treated like numbers on a balance sheet." The next morning brought an ultimatum from the board of directors: sign the merger agreement immediately or face a vote of no confidence that would remove Elena from her position as CEO. The pressure was overwhelming, coming from every direction: lawyers, accountants, shareholders, executives who had hitched their careers to this deal's success. Elena found herself standing once again in the executive boardroom where this crisis had begun, surrounded by men in expensive suits who spoke about fiduciary responsibility and market opportunities while avoiding eye contact with the moral reality of their decisions. "You have a responsibility to your shareholders," Morrison insisted, his voice carrying barely controlled frustration. "Personal feelings can't interfere with business judgment. Sign the papers, Elena. End this nonsense." Mark appeared in the boardroom doorway, not to clean, but to offer his resignation letter, a gesture designed to remove the excuse her opponents used to justify their demands. "I'll find another job," he told Elena quietly. "You don't have to choose between me and your company." But before Elena could respond, Hannah appeared beside her father, having come to the office after school as she sometimes did when Mark worked late shifts. She had overheard enough adult conversations to understand that her father was in trouble for trying to help people. "Dad," she whispered, her voice carrying across the silent boardroom, "you always tell me that heroes do the hard thing, even when they're scared, even when other people don't understand." Shriwa. The 12-year-old's words hung in the air like a challenge to everyone present, a reminder that moral courage wasn't measured by wealth or position, but by willingness to act according to conscience when action required sacrifice. Elena looked at Mark, then at Hannah, then at the room full of executives who saw quarterly profits where she was learning to see human faces. The merger documents lay spread across the mahogany table like a test of everything she claimed to believe about leadership and responsibility. In that moment, Elena realized that signing the contract would accomplish more than just completing a business transaction. It would define who she was as a person, what kind of world she was helping to create, and whether she possessed the courage to choose what was right over what was profitable. The room held its breath as Elena reached for the papers, her decision carrying consequences that would ripple through thousands of lives and determine whether Mark's risk had been worth taking. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the merger contract from the polished mahogany table. Every eye in the boardroom focused on her movements. The documents represented years of negotiation, billions of dollars in potential profits, and the culmination of strategic planning that had consumed her company's resources for months. Instead of reaching for her pen, Elena gripped the contract with both hands and tore it cleanly in half, the sound of ripping paper echoing through the stunned silence like a gunshot. "This deal dies today," she declared, her voice carrying the finality of someone who had chosen conscience over commerce. "We will not sacrifice 15,000 jobs for shareholder profits. We will not destroy communities that have supported this company for decades. We will find another way to grow, one that doesn't require us to forget our humanity." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Board members shouted objections, threatened lawsuits, predicted financial disaster for the company and personal ruin for Elena. Several executives stormed out of the meeting, vowing to contact shareholders and regulatory agencies about their CEO's apparent breakdown. But Elena remained calm in the center of the chaos, her decision made and her conscience finally aligned with her actions. She looked directly at Mark, who stood in the doorway with Hannah beside him, both of them witnessing the moment when corporate power chose to serve people rather than dominating them. News of Elena's decision spread through the company and beyond with the speed of social media and financial networks. Workers at the manufacturing plants, who had been quietly updating their resumes and preparing for unemployment, gathered around break room televisions to watch coverage of their unexpected reprieve. Financial analysts predicted disaster for Carter Industries, warning that rejecting such a lucrative merger would damage investor confidence and limit future growth opportunities. But something unexpected happened. The stock price stabilized as ethical investment funds began purchasing shares, attracted by a company willing to prioritize long-term sustainability over short-term profits. Mark was quietly offered a new position, Senior Advisor for Community Affairs, with a salary that would allow him to move Hannah out of their cramped apartment into a house with a yard where she could run and play safely. At first, he resisted the promotion, uncomfortable with the idea of accepting rewards for simply doing what was right. "I need someone who remembers who we serve," Elena insisted during their private meeting in her office. "Someone who understands that our decisions affect real families, not just financial projections. Someone who has the courage to speak truth to power when power needs to hear the truth." Hannah's reaction to her father's new job was immediate and joyful. "See, Dad, I told you that you were a superhero. Now everyone else knows it too." The transformation in their lives was gradual but profound. Mark traded his janitor's uniform for business casual attire, but he never lost the observational skills and moral clarity that had made him valuable to Elena. His first initiative was establishing a worker advocacy program that gave employees direct input into corporate decisions that affected their lives. Elena began spending time outside her corporate bubble, visiting the manufacturing plants she had almost closed, meeting the families whose livelihoods had hung in the balance while she weighed profits against people. She discovered that understanding her company's impact required more than reading quarterly reports. It required listening to voices that had been invisible to her before Mark forced her to see them. 3 months after the torn contract, Elena found herself sitting in Mark and Hannah's new kitchen, sharing a dinner of slightly burned pancakes that Hannah had insisted on making herself. The conversation flowed easily between discussions of Hannah's art projects, Mark's community outreach initiatives, and Elena's growing understanding that success could be measured in more than financial terms. "You know," Elena said as Hannah showed her latest superhero drawing, this one featuring a woman in a business suit standing beside a man with a cape, both of them protecting a group of smiling families. "I spent years thinking that being powerful meant making the tough decisions. It turns out that being powerful means making the right decisions, even when they're tough." Mark smiled, watching his daughter color while explaining to Elena the specific superpowers each figure possessed. "Hannah teaches me that every day. Heroes aren't the people who never get scared. They're the people who do the right thing even when they are scared." The evening ended with Elena helping to wash dishes in their modest kitchen, laughing at Hannah's stories about school friends, and feeling more fulfilled than she had during years of corporate victories and financial achievements. A new kind of family had formed, not through blood or marriage, but through shared values and mutual respect, through the recognition that some bonds are stronger than social class or economic status, through the understanding that real leadership means serving others rather than being served by them. If this story inspired you, subscribe to our Heart Stories for more emotional tales of love, hope, and the second chances that transform ordinary people into heroes.